August 18th, 1940. A warm, hazy Sunday morning in southern England. For most, it was a day for church, for gardening, or for a quiet walk along the white cliffs of Dover. But as the sun climbed higher, the air began to vibrate with a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. The sound of nearly 1,000 German aircraft. By the summer of 1940, the world believed Great Britain was finished. France had fallen in weeks. The British Army had been chased off the continent at Dunkirk, leaving their heavy equipment behind. Across the narrow strip of the English Channel, the most powerful air force on the planet, the Luftwaffe, was massing for the final blow. Adolf Hitler called it Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But there was one thing standing in his way: a thin line of young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes. Today we often remember September 15th as the climax of the Battle of Britain. But for the men who were actually there, the real turning point happened nearly a month earlier. They called it the hardest day. It was the largest aerial engagement in history up to that point. It was a day of desperate gambles, catastrophic intelligence failures, and the level of carnage that almost broke both sides. But before we dive into the smoke and fire of that Sunday afternoon, we have to ask, how did a force that was outnumbered 2-1 manage to hold the line? Why did the legendary Stuka dive bomber, the terror of Europe, suddenly vanish from the skies after this single day? And what was the secret nervous system that allowed the British to see the enemy coming before they even left the ground? This is the story of the 24 hours that decided the fate of the free world. This is the story of the hardest day. To understand why August 18th was so violent, we have to understand the stakes. Hitler didn't actually want to invade Britain. He hoped the British would see the writing on the wall and sue for peace. But Churchill had other ideas. When peace overtures were rejected, Hitler issued Directive Number 16. The invasion was on. But there was a massive problem for the Germans: the Royal Navy. The British Home Fleet was the most powerful naval force in Europe. If the German army tried to cross the channel in slow-moving barges, the Royal Navy would turn the channel into a graveyard. The only way the invasion could work was if the Luftwaffe could sink the British ships from the air. And the only way they could do that was if they first destroyed the Royal Air Force. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was confident. He told Hitler it would take only a few days to wipe out the RAF in the south, and maybe a few weeks to destroy the rest. But Göring was flying blind. German intelligence, the Abwehr, was disastrously wrong. On August 17th, they told Göring that the RAF was down to its last 300 fighters. They believed the British were desperate, flying their last reserves. In reality, the British had over 800 serviceable fighters, with hundreds more waiting in the wings. The Germans weren't just fighting a dying air force, they were flying into a buzzsaw. The doubting system, the eyes of Britain. While the Germans relied on raw numbers and the skill of their pilots, the British had something else, something the Germans didn't fully understand. We call it the doubting system, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Imagine a giant spider web stretched across the coast of England. At the edge of this web were the chain-home radar stations, massive steel towers that could see German planes over 100 miles away. But radar was only the beginning. The information from those towers was sent to a central filter room at Bentley Priory. There, it was cross-referenced with reports from the Observer Corps, thousands of volunteers on the ground with binoculars and telephones. All of this data was plotted on giant maps in sector rooms. Controllers could see exactly where the enemy was, how fast they were moving, and how high they were flying. This meant the British didn't have to waste fuel and exhaust their pilots by flying constant patrols. They could wait for the very last second, scramble their squadrons, and place them exactly where they needed to be to intercept the German bombers. The Germans saw the radar towers, but they didn't realize they were the nervous system of the entire defense. They thought if they hit the airfields, the RAF would die. They didn't realize as long as the eyes were open, the RAF could keep fighting. The tactical clash, Vic versus Finger 4. When the planes finally met in the sky, the tactics were as different as the philosophies behind them. The British were still using pre-war formations. They flew in what was called the Vic, a tight three-plane V-shape. It looked great in air shows, but in combat it was a nightmare. Pilots had to spend so much time making sure they didn't collide with their wingmen that they couldn't look for the enemy. However, the Germans had learned the hard way in the Spanish Civil War. They used the Schwarm, or the Finger 4. It was loose, flexible, and allowed every pilot to scan the horizon. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 was arguably the best fighter in the world at the time. It was faster than the Hurricane and could outclimb the Spitfire. But it had one fatal flaw: fuel. The Bf 109 only had enough fuel for about 20 minutes of combat over England. If a German pilot stayed in a dogfight for too long, he wouldn't have enough gas to get back across the channel. This created a ticking clock for every German raid. They had to strike hard, strike fast, and get out. And on August 18th, Kesselring decided to stop playing games. He ordered a concentrated strike on the heart of the RAF, the sector stations of Kenley and Biggin Hill. The raid on Kenley, the low-level gamble. Lunchtime, August 18th, the first major wave begins. The Germans came up with a bold, terrifying plan for RAF Kenley. While high-altitude bombers cratered the runways, a specialist unit, 9 Stoffel of KG-76, would sneak in at wave-top height. 9 Dornier Do-17 bombers, flying so low they were literally skimming the hedges, crossed the coast at Beachy Head. They followed the railway lines straight to Kenley. The British radar didn't see them. They were too low. But the observer corps did. A frantic phone call went out. Low-flying bombers heading for Kenley. As the Dorniers roared over the airfield, they were met with a hellscape of ground fire. The British had a new secret weapon, the parachute and cable rocket. They fired rockets into the air that deployed long steel cables held up by parachutes. One Dornier, already on fire, hit a cable and was yanked out of the sky like a hooked fish. It crashed, killing everyone on board. Despite the fire, the German pilots were incredibly disciplined. They dropped their bombs with surgical precision, destroying 10 hangars and smashing the operations room. But the cost was staggering. Every single one of the 9 Dorniers was hit. 4 were destroyed. The commander of the unit was killed. The Kenley raid was a tactical masterpiece, but it proved one thing. Low-level bombing against a prepared defense was suicide. The Luftwaffe would never try it on this scale again. The Stuka disaster, the death of a legend. While the battle raged over Kenley, another drama was unfolding to the south. The Junkers UJ-87 Stuka, with its cranked wings and its Jericho trumpet siren, it was the symbol of the Blitzkrieg. It had terrified Poland, Norway, and France. It was the most accurate dive bomber in the world. On the afternoon of August 18th, the Luftwaffe sent 109 Stukas to destroy British radar stations and coastal airfields. But the Stuka had a weakness. It was slow. And to dive bomb accurately, it had to fly in a straight line. As the Stukas began their dives over Poling and Ford, the RAF was waiting. Hurricanes from 43 and 601 squadrons tore into the German formations. It wasn't a dogfight, it was a massacre. The Stukas were like sitting ducks. Their rear gunners tried to fight back, but their small caliber machine guns were no match for the 8 Browning machine guns of a Hurricane. In just a few minutes, 16 Stukas were blown out of the sky. Dozens more limped back to France, riddled with holes and carrying dead or dying crewmen. The myth of the Stuka was dead. Reichsmarshal Goering was horrified. The RE-U-87 was too precious to lose at this rate. After the hardest day, the Stuka was largely withdrawn from the Battle of Britain. The Germans had just lost their most accurate precision weapon. The resilience of the radar. The Germans did manage to hit their targets. The radar station at Poling was smashed. The towers were still standing, but the delicate electronics inside were ruined. For a moment, there was a hole in Britain's eyes, but this is where German intelligence failed again. They thought the radar stations were fragile and impossible to replace. They didn't know that the British had mobile radar units hidden in the woods nearby. Within hours, these mobile units were powered up, filling the gap. The chain home system was redundant, resilient, and virtually impossible to kill. The Luftwaffe pilots returned to France and reported that the radar was destroyed. Their commanders believed them, but the next day when the Germans returned, the British were waiting for them again. Exactly as before. The Germans were punching a ghost. The third wave and the weather. By 5 p.m., both sides were exhausted. Ground crews were working frantically to patch up planes and refuel them. Pilots were falling asleep in their cockpits. But the Luftwaffe had one more move. A third wave of over 100 bombers was sent to hit North Weald and Hornchurch. This was the moment the RAF could have broken. Many of the squadrons in the south had already flown 4 or 5 missions that day. But then, the English weather, the most unreliable ally in history, stepped in. A thick gray haze began to roll in from the North Sea. Cloud levels dropped to 3,000 feet. The German bomber pilots, looking down from 2 miles up, couldn't see their targets. They wandered over the clouds, searched for a gap, and found nothing. Frustrated and running low on fuel, many formations turned back. Some dumped their bombs into the sea, others dropped them blindly through the clouds, hitting empty fields and small coastal towns. The hardest day ended not with a bang, but with a whimper in the fog. As the sun set on August 18th, the propaganda machines went into overdrive. The BBC announced to a cheering nation that the RAF had shot down 144 German planes. In Berlin, the Nazi radio claimed they had destroyed 147 British fighters. The truth was much more sobering. The actual losses were almost dead even. The Germans lost around 70 aircraft. The British lost 68, if you count the ones destroyed on the ground. But there was a crucial difference. When a British pilot bailed out, he landed in a meadow in Kent, had a cup of tea, and was back in a new cockpit the next morning. When a German pilot bailed out, he was either dead, drowned in the Channel, or a prisoner of war. The Luftwaffe was losing its most experienced crews, men who had flown in Spain and Poland. These were men who couldn't be replaced by a few weeks of training. The hardest day was a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, the side that can't replace its losses first is the side that loses. Goering's fury and a turning point. The day after the battle, Hermann Goering was in a state of shock. He had expected a quick victory. Instead, he had lost 70 planes in a single day. He summoned his top fighter aces, men like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders, to his palatial estate, Corinthal. He screamed at them. He accused the fighter pilots of being cowards. He demanded to know why they weren't protecting the bombers. Galland, one of the most famous pilots in history, was so insulted that he famously told Goering, "If you want us to win, then give me a squadron of Spitfires." Goering didn't give him Spitfires. Instead, he purged his commanders. He fired the older officers and promoted the young hotshots. He ordered the fighters to stay closer to the bombers, a move that actually made the fighters less effective because it took away their speed and initiative. The hardest day had broken Goering's confidence. He began to hesitate. He began to change targets. And in the end, that hesitation gave the RAF the breathing room it needed to survive. Conclusion: the legacy of the hardest day.
So, why does the hardest day matter? It matters because it was the day the Luftwaffe realized they couldn't win a quick war. It was the day the Stuka died. It was the day the British radar proved it was invincible. And most importantly, it was the day that showed the world that the Nazi war machine could be stopped. The men who flew on August 18th didn't know they were making history. They were just tired, scared, and doing their jobs. But because they held the line on that hardest day, the invasion of Britain never happened. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then cancelled, and Hitler eventually turned his eyes toward Russia. The world we live in today was built on the courage of those few hundred pilots who went up into the haze of a Sunday afternoon in 1940. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hardest day, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the front lines of history. And I want to hear from you. If you were a British commander in 1940, would you have risked everything to defend the radar stations? Or would you have pulled your fighters back to save them for the invasion? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.